There comes a stage in life when words begin to feel heavy. You no longer rush to defend your tone, to clarify your meaning, or to prove your kindness. It's not that you've stopped caring. It's that every attempt to explain seems to pull you further from peace. For years you tried to make yourself understandable, twisting your sentences softer, trimming your emotions smaller, hoping that if you said it right this time, someone would finally hear you as you meant to be heard. But explanations slowly turned into erosion, each clarification taking a little piece of your calm with it. So now, you choose silence. You let misunderstanding live where it wants to. You no longer chase correction. You guard your energy instead. To others, it might look like indifference, but beneath that stillness lies something deeply human. The exhaustion of a heart that has tried too long to be seen. When someone stops explaining themselves, it is not rebellion. It is the body's quiet way of saying enough. Psychologically, this behavior can be traced to a long pattern of emotional invalidation. Each time a person opens up and is met not with understanding but with dismissal, sarcasm, or distortion, the brain records a lesson that communication is not safe. Over years, this repeated experience reshapes their emotional landscape. They begin to associate vulnerability with exhaustion, dialogue with danger, and self-expression with futility. From a neurological standpoint, the stress system plays a central role. When conversations become battlegrounds, the amygdala activates as if under threat. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and articulation, becomes less accessible, leaving the person speechless, not by choice, but by biology. Silence, in this sense, is a nervous system's attempt to preserve equilibrium. Attachment theory provides another layer of understanding. Those who grew up feeling unheard may internalize a script. No one will believe me anyway. Anxiously attached individuals once over-explain to seek reassurance. Avoidantly attached ones learn to retreat. Both may eventually reach the same emotional destination. A form of learned quietness. A psychological retreat where solitude feels safer than dialogue. What's often mistaken for coldness is actually the residue of empathy. Fatigue. When you care deeply but are consistently misunderstood, your emotional circuits overload. The instinct to clarify transforms into a need to protect your inner world from further distortion. You stop explaining not because you lack feeling, but because every word begins to feel like self-betrayal. In that silence, there is both sadness and self-respect. The mind says, if I must keep defending who I am, perhaps I'm speaking to the wrong people. And so instead of arguing, you begin to conserve. Instead of proving, you begin to preserve. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional triage. There is a strange duality in the silence of those who stop explaining themselves. On one hand, it feels like freedom, the release of a long-held tension, the quiet triumph of no longer needing to be understood to exist peacefully. On the other hand, it carries the quiet ache of distance, the realization that every wall built for safety also blocks warmth. This is the paradox at the heart of emotional withdrawal. The peace you gain becomes the loneliness you must learn to live with. At first, the silence feels like relief. No more defending tone or motive, no more endless clarifications that spiral into new misunderstandings. For once, you are not performing the exhausting labor of justification. The energy once spent managing others' perceptions begins to return. Home, to rest, to reflection, to inner calm. You begin to notice how much of your life was spent explaining your softness to the harsh, your sensitivity to the numb, your sincerity to the skeptical. There's liberation in finally stopping. It feels like reclaiming time, dignity, and quiet. But that quiet soon becomes its own teacher. Because in your newfound stillness, you start to feel a subtle isolation. People drift away, not out of malice, but confusion. They sense your silence and interpret it as pride. They say, "You've changed," or "You don't care anymore." And though you wish they could see that your silence was born from care, you realize most people only hear words, not the reasons behind their absence. The paradox deepens. The same act that protects your peace can also prevent intimacy. By refusing to explain, you also refuse to let others understand, even those who might have been capable of it. You start to wonder whether the wall you built was meant to keep pain out or to keep yourself in. The silence, once empowering, starts to echo. It becomes heavy in rooms where connection once lived. This is the price of self-preservation, peace traded for proximity. You find yourself existing at a gentle distance from others. Calm, yes, but slightly untouchable. You nod, you smile, you participate, but you no longer reveal the full complexity of what moves inside you. You've learned that transparency can be misused, that vulnerability can be mistaken for weakness. And so you share less, trust less, need less. The world perceives this as strength, and in some ways it is. But it is also a quiet form of grief, mourning the version of you who once believed that being fully seen was safe. There is also a subtler paradox. Your silence begins to influence how others see themselves. When you stop explaining, those who relied on your emotional labor begin to confront their own discomfort. Some project guilt, others resentment. They miss the clarity you used to give them. The reassurance, the patient explanations that made them feel understood, even when they failed to understand you. Your absence of explanation forces them to meet themselves without your mediation. In that way, your silence becomes a mirror, one that reveals more than your words ever did. Still, not all consequences are beautiful. Over time, this detachment can harden. The same calm that once felt sacred can become sterile. You begin to withhold even from those who haven't hurt you, assuming misunderstanding before it even happens. You learn to live in self-containment so deeply that even love starts to feel intrusive. And perhaps this is the real cost. Not loneliness, but the slow dulling of relational trust. Yet beneath all this contradiction, there lies a deeper wisdom. You have learned the sacred economy of energy. When to speak, when to hold back, and when to let silence be your final language. Still, the question remains, is this peace truly peace, or merely a softer kind of exile? At some point, the psychological edges of this silence begin to blur into something more existential. You start to ask yourself questions that no longer belong to therapy, but to philosophy. Why do we need to be understood at all? What is this hunger to explain? This desperate longing for another mind to hold ours without distortion? Is it a form of love, or merely an attempt to escape loneliness through comprehension? To explain oneself is to seek translation, to turn the unspoken interior into a language that another can grasp. But every translation is a distortion, every word an approximation. Perhaps then the pain of being misunderstood is inevitable, not because others fail to listen, but because language itself is an imperfect bridge. Maybe silence is not surrender, but acknowledgement, an acceptance that some parts of us cannot and perhaps should not be fully translated. Still, there is a quiet sorrow in that acceptance. Human beings are built for communion. Even the most self-contained souls crave recognition, not applause, but resonance. When you stop explaining, you save yourself from misinterpretation, but you also risk starving that essential human need to be known. The silence that protects can also erode meaning. When no one knows your interior world, even you begin to lose touch with it. Because we discover ourselves not only through solitude, but through dialogue, through the mirror of another's understanding. This is where the existential paradox deepens. Communication, flawed as it is also what gives life texture. Every exchange, even the imperfect ones, shapes the contours of who we are. When you withdraw too long, you begin to lose the language of connection. You forget the rhythm of trust. And yet, you also realize that the longing to be understood can become a subtle form of bondage, a chain that ties your worth to others' comprehension. The philosopher Kierkegaard once wrote that the most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. Silence, in this sense, can feel like that, a premature acceptance that no future explanation will lead to recognition. You choose peace, but sometimes that peace is only another word for giving up the possibility of being seen. And yet, not all forms of silence are despair. There exists a mature silence, one that does not arise from resignation, but from transcendence. This is the silence of those who have made peace with ambiguity, who no longer seek to convert every feeling into clarity. They understand that the human soul is not a thesis to be defended, but a landscape to be witnessed. In this higher form of quiet, the absence of explanation is not a wall, but a boundary of dignity, a way of saying, my truth does not need to be proven to exist. This shift marks a profound evolution in consciousness. It is the difference between seeking validation and embodying self-trust. The first demands witnesses. The second requires only awareness. When you reach this stage, you stop explaining not because you've grown cold, but because you've learned to live without translation, to honor your complexity even when it cannot be explained. But there is one more challenge that waits here: how to remain open without returning to the old exhaustion. Because total retreat is not wisdom. It is simply another extreme. The task, perhaps, is to hold both truths at once. To stay soft without being porous, to remain open without being emptied, to learn that the purpose of communication is not always to be understood, but sometimes simply to share the beauty of being seen trying. In this way, silence becomes not a withdrawal, but a form of reverence, a recognition that not every truth requires an audience, and not every wound needs to be witnessed to heal. Healing begins when silence turns from escape into choice. You learn that you don't owe explanations to everyone, but you also realize that isolation is not the goal. Integrity is. The art lies in discernment, knowing when to speak and to whom. You begin to understand that not every listener deserves access to your inner world, yet a few, the patient ones, the gentle ones, may still earn it. Their presence reminds you that communication, when safe, can be sacred again. To stop explaining yourself is not to build a wall around your truth. It is to stop offering it to those who only come to rearrange it. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not the absence of connection, but the boundary that allows real connection to happen. It is the difference between defending yourself and protecting your peace. And so the reframe emerges. You were never wrong for wanting to be understood. You simply learned that understanding cannot be demanded, only invited. The goal is no longer to make everyone see you, but to live so honestly that misunderstanding no longer threatens you. To speak when it feels nourishing, to be silent when it feels sacred. In the end, being understood is a gift, but being at peace with being misunderstood, that is freedom.